Today we're going to demonstrate the process of making maple syrup. And Wisconsin has a long history of maple syrup making. This includes the first people that lived here, like the Menominee and other First Nations. In the 1600s, the European settlers came to Wisconsin and they also made maple syrup, and people make maple syrup today. So in February, late February and into March is really a special time in Wisconsin because that's when people make maple syrup. And that syrup is made from the sap of maple trees because their sap has the highest concentration of sugar, and that's what makes the syrup so sweet. So where does that sugar come from? Well, it's all through a process called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the science word for how plants and trees make their food, which is that sugar. Photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplasts, which are in the leaves, and uses sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to create glucose, which is the sugar, and there's oxygen left over, which is released into the air. Now in the fall, maple trees and other deciduous trees need to prepare for winter, and they do this by storing up some of that extra glucose or sugar, and then their leaves change color and fall off, and those trees kind of just sleep or go dormant for the winter time. But this time of year, late February and March, when we have days above freezing and nights below freezing, this causes the trees to wake up and water starts to come up the tree. That water carries that sugar, so water and sugar is really the sap in the tree, right? Carries that around in the tree, and that sugar is what will help grow the buds and the new leaves for that growing season. And then the tree can continue making its own food through photosynthesis with these new leaves. And it's actually a little bit of that sap that people collect to make maple syrup.
Hey, so you're ready to tap a tree, but how do you know which tree is a maple tree to tap? Well, we have a few different ways that we can identify trees, and I'm going to show you a couple of those right now. If you're trying to find a maple tree to tap, one way to do it is to determine whether it's has opposite or alternate branches. Maple trees have opposite branches. I'm going to show you an example of each though. This is a tree branch that would have alternate branches. You can see how the branches come out not across from each other, they alternate above and below each other. But these are from a maple tree, and even though they're just little nodules, you can see they come out exactly opposite of each other. So that's a way for you to be able to identify that that's a maple tree with opposite branching. Another way you can identify a maple tree is, of course, looking around to see if there are maple leaves below the tree. Now, there might be other leaves that have blown in from the wind, but you're probably going to find a lot of maple leaves. So I just happened to look down, and yeah, we've got maple leaves, which are kind of those palm-shaped leaves. We've got those below our tree here, and so that's another way of identifying a maple tree. Another way we can identify is that maple trees have wonderful red buds on the ends of their branches, and it may be a little hard to see, but if you look up at the blue sky, you can kind of see the red. If you've got one, if you think you have one in your yard, try and look really close and you can see the red buds. One other distinction that we can look for is the kind of bark that the tree has. Maple trees tend to have plated kind of bark as opposed to deep wrinkly bark. So that can be kind of tricky, but that's just another piece of the puzzle that helps you identify maple trees for tapping.
So in order to collect the sap out of the tree, we need to tap the tree. We need to make a hole. We need to put a spile in the hole, which kind of looks like a faucet. We need a way to collect the sap, and then we have to boil it down into syrup. So here we have a maple tree already that we picked out, and in order to make sure we can use this tree, we have to measure the circumference, or how big around the tree is. It needs to be at least 30 inches for us to tap it. So I'm going to take out a tape measure here and measure the circumference at about my chest height, making sure it's about even all the way around. It looks even. So this tree is just under 49 inches. Okay, so now that we know that, I'm going to take a look at the circumference chart. And I see here that it needs to be at least 30 inches to put one tap in the tree. If this tree were 54 inches, we could put 2 taps. And if the tree had a circumference of 72 inches, we could actually do 3 taps in one tree. If this tree were under 30 inches, we would just leave it be, let it grow a few more years, and come back to see if it's big enough to tap then. Next, we need to determine the south side of the tree, because that's the side of the tree the sun shines on the most and can warm up the sap faster, so we might have more sap flow. So to do that, I have a compass with me today, and I'm gonna put thread in the shed here to find north. Oh. So, behind me is north, which means this side is the south side of the tree. It makes sense because the sun's shining on it right now too. So now we want to look for old tap holes, and they kind of look like belly buttons on the tree. Old tap holes are last year's tap or previous years, and what happens is the tree actually makes a scar over the hole, kind of like when we fall and we get a cut or a scrape, then we kind of get a scab over it, right? So we want to look for old tap holes, and I see there's one here that's quite old. It's almost looks just like bark. And it looks like there's one right over here as well that's a little fresher, maybe from just a couple years ago. But I can see, if I look in there, it is scarred over and healed over. Now we want to look for old tap holes and measure away from those holes to figure out where we're going to put this year's tap, because we don't want to put too many taps in the same area, creating a lot of scar tissue in the tree. That's not good. So I'm going to use this tap hole. And I have a little rule chart here that helps me figure out what I'm doing. It says that I should measure 6 inches to either side of that tap hole, and then 4 inches above or below. And that's going to help me figure out where to put this year's tap. So I'm going to do that here. I'm going to go from this hole and measure 6. That would be here. And then I'm going to go up 4 instead of down, because it's nice to have the sap up a little higher away from other potential critters. So this is where we'd like to put the tap hole. Finally, I need to just look and see, are there any tap holes within 24 inches up from where my finger is, or 24 inches below? And I don't see any. So this is where we're going to put our tap for this year. All right, now that we know where we're going to put the tap, it's the fun part. We're going to drill a hole in the tree. I'm going to use a hand drill or a brace and bit. This is a tool that the settlers would have used, because back then in the 1600s we didn't have batteries for power drills, right? So we're going to drill into the tree just about 2 inches. That's all the further we need to go in order to access the sap. And that's why I have this duct tape here. Once we're up to the duct tape, I know we're in far enough. So in order to do this, I'm going to lean my body against the circle part here and lean in and use my muscle. And you're gonna see as I drill some wood chips shavings coming out, and hopefully they look wet, because that means the sap is flowing today. And hopefully it is, because it's above freezing. It's about 40 degrees and sunny. Almost there. All right, and we're there. So now I'm gonna back off and just go the opposite way to drill out. We don't ever want to pull this out, because that could break the bit and injure the tree. And there we go. So we're going to use a plastic spile today. This is one that is commonly used now. And you'll see this is the opening or the mouth of the spile. And the narrow end is what actually goes in the hole we just made. And if I flip it over, you'll see there's a small hole there. And that's where the sap is going to go into that's how it goes into the spile. And then it comes out the mouth. And we'll show you how we collect it here in a second. But I'm going to go ahead and put the narrow end into the hole we just created with our hand drill. And then I'm going to go ahead and gently just tap on this little top piece. And we don't want to put it in too far, just so that it's not easy to wiggle or move out. And that looks good to me, and we're going to let that sap flow. Woohoo! So we've got sap coming out of our spile, and now we need a way to collect it. So I'm going to use a real simple tool here, a plastic bag that fits on a metal frame and a cover. There's a hole on the frame that's going to fit over the spile, and the sap will just fall into this bag, and we'll collect it once it's full. So I'm going to move that little hook out of the way here, and this bag just hangs like this. And people often ask how long it takes for that bag to fill up, and really it has to do with the temperature and how quickly the sap is flowing, but definitely this bag can be filled in 24 hours. So once our sap bags are full, we could either empty those bags into big buckets and carry them over to the fire or wherever we're going to make the syrup. Something else we could use is a yoke, which is what the settlers would have used, the pioneers, and they would pour sap into the buckets on either side, and then they carry the sap with their muscles over to the fire. Now some of the places that had larger operations of maple syrup making would use their animals to help haul the sap out of the forest and over to where it's going to be processed into syrup. As I mentioned earlier, people have been making maple syrup for a very long time, and they've used different tools over that time. I want to show you a couple of different kinds of tools. So let's start with the Menominee and other First Nations that lived here. All of their tools would have been from nature. Their spile looks very different than what we use today. We had plastic, right? They used wood, maybe from a sumac tree, because it's very hollow in the center or soft in the center, so they could easily hollow it out. And this is what they would have put in as their spile. And then to collect the sap, they would have used a birch bark basket that they made out of birch bark and other materials from nature. And they would have let this fill up with the sap as a way to collect. Now the settlers would have used other materials. One example is a little bit harder wood for a spile. So this is made out of maybe oak or maple. And they would have put that into the tree and hung a wooden bucket. Now, unfortunately, animals can get in there, right? So over time, when metals became more available, they would have been using metal buckets that had a cover to keep those critters out. There are other tools as well, but this is just a few examples of some of the tools people would have used over time.
So you've tapped your sap and you want to make syrup. Well, before we can do that, we need to learn a little bit about the science of sap. This chart will help us understand what sap is actually made of. If you see the big blue section of this graph, it shows that 97.5% of sap is actually water. Where did that come from? Well, if you think about the snow that melted from the wintertime in late February and early March turned to water, that's what's slowly now moving up into the tree. What are the other percentages? Well, 2% is sugar. That's pretty typical for maple trees in Wisconsin. And remember where that sugar came from? Photosynthesis that happened last summer. And then we have 0.5% that's minerals. And those are just picked up through the soil as the water moves up into the tree. And those minerals are just like nutrients, just like vitamins that you and I have in our bodies. Those are used for the tree for its health too. So we want to change the percentage so that there's less water and more sugar so that we can have our syrup on our pancakes. So how do we do that? Well, we're at the boiling station. And if you think about the three forms of water, solid, liquid, and gas, what we have here is water in its liquid form in our pot. That's our sap. And remember, there's a lot of water in that sap. We want to boil that down so that we have a higher percentage of sugar. So by boiling it, we're turning our water into a gas. And in that way, we get a change in the percentages. So now, to get it to the point where it's syrup that's usable, we only have 34% water and 66% sugar. And how do we know when we get to that exact point? We can use a tool called a hydrometer. The last thing we want to do is get out any impurities. We're going to use some sort of a filter similar to this to make sure that the syrup has no impurities, anything left in it that would be bad for us. And we're going to end up storing it in some sort of a glass container similar to this. A lot of times people wonder, well, how much sap actually boils down to how much syrup? Well, here's a comparison for you. It takes about 40 gallons of sap, what you see with these two containers here, to boil down to make just 1 gallon of syrup. So when you think about this whole process you've seen today, and you think about all the work that it took and how much sap it took just to make 1 gallon of syrup, you can truly say when you eat your pancakes that you're having them with some liquid gold.
So now we're inside our sugar shack, which many people have today if they make maple syrup. And in the shack is this big evaporator pan. We actually have 2 here. And this is what we would use to boil down the sap into syrup in a more efficient way. Our evaporator pan is actually fueled by a wood-burning stove, so you can see that underneath the pan. We would stoke up the fire with wood. Some people have a sugar shack that runs on gas or even electricity. Now the sap would actually go into the bigger pan first. The bottom has more deep channels in here, and that helps transfer the heat from the fire more efficiently to the sap, so we can boil that water off to get a more concentrated sap, getting closer to syrup. And once it starts to get thicker, so that concentration is getting better, we would actually transfer that down to the smaller pan by just turning the red knobs on either side. That allows us to move the syrup or the sap to the smaller pan. Now the smaller pan is shallower and has a flat bottom so that we can make sure that that syrup doesn't burn. But we do have to keep an eye on it because it can burn pretty quickly. So we'll keep an eye on it. When it starts to look more like syrup, we would use that hydrometer so we know when it's ready, and we pull it off, and then we would filter and bottle just like we explained earlier. So I'm glad you joined us today. Thank you for learning about maple syrup. I hope you enjoyed learning about the whole process from the tree all the way to the syrup.